Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Esoteric. I got a fun and random episode for you guys this evening because it seems like 2022 is going to be the year of new games on retro consoles. We've gotten so many different experiences, like Symphony of the Night on Sega Saturn having a new version or the prototype of Saturn Bomberman on the Sega Saturn. But we also now have Tomb Raider, at least a demo of it, on the Sega 32X. The 32X never gets new games whatsoever. Last year I did a video on Tomb Raider running on the 3DO, and that was a ton of fun. But seeing Tomb Raider here running in OpenLara on the 32X is just a ton of fun. This is such a classic quintessential game of the generation in the 90s, and it should be on pretty much every piece of hardware ever because this thing got ported all over the place. But seeing it running on the 32X, seeing it running at a relatively stable and decent frame rate, drawing all the graphics on hardware that barely got many 3D games is just in and of itself wild. Before I get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. And tell me if you're enjoying these update videos on new experiences. They've been fun to make, and I might keep doing them so long as you guys keep watching. But Tomb Raider is one of those classic games of the 90s. When this game came out, it took absolutely the world by storm, and obviously Tomb Raider is still with us as a series today. Lara Croft as a character became hyper popular for all the right and all the wrong reasons, and here on 32X this looks really good. It's definitely not doing the exact same thing you would expect out of the Sega Saturn or the PlayStation 1, but the 32X definitely had a lot of 3D power that was never really fully tapped by most developers. So seeing the game ported over to the 32X running in 3D in double-digit frame rates in and of itself is an absolute accomplishment, and I'm sure there could be some optimization done to get this up to an even more stable frame rate. But you'll see here all of this is running in 3D in real time. It's all texture mapped. Laura's model is here, and as you move the camera around you will see some warping in the polygons, but that really isn't that unusual for 3D hardware of the era. Only the Nintendo 64 had those perspective correct textures and the lack of warping on polygons in and of itself. But this is just so much fun to talk about. I love when fans take games that we know and love and pivot them to other hardware, or when we get prototypes of games that we've never checked out before. And just seeing Tomb Raider run on the 32X, it feels like it shouldn't actually work. Obviously the 32X was a stopgap measure for Sega before they could get to the Sega Saturn, and while it did have some fun games on it, it was a complete failure at retail. But if games like Tomb Raider had actually existed on the 32X, I think you would have seen a lot better sales numbers, but obviously this game didn't exist when the 32X came out, so how would that even be possible? But you'll see here all of the gameplay is intact. There is no audio whatsoever on this version, and hopefully that comes in a new update. But again, this just seems like something that shouldn't technically work. The 32X seems to be punching well above its weight here, but that's the great thing about modern developments on retro gaming hardware. People have learned a lot more about the hardware over the last few decades, and they now know more than developers that had it when it was new, and that is why you get experiences like this possible. I don't know in the 90s if anyone could actually get something like this running on 32X, but in 2023 and 2024 that capability is now here. And if you are curious, this will run on MiSTer FPGA and pretty much any 32X emulator, and I do have an EverDrive for my 32X, and I haven't tested it yet on real hardware, but you don't need real hardware to experience this, and that is what I'd love to show off in the videos. Different ways for you guys to enjoy something if you don't have the real hardware, and big thanks to Andy D for helping with the captures this week as well. He's the one that actually told me this came out. I saw the news about 2 hours later, but he gave me the first heads up. But again, just looking at Lara Croft's model here, turning the camera around, this is a fully 3D game. Everything is 3D from the areas that you're in to the character models. The only 2D elements would be menu items and the frame rate counter up at the top, and obviously the textures. But it is impressive that the 32X can even do this. I know this isn't 30 frames per second, but you shouldn't expect that. You should just be surprised and marvel at the fact that this is even running. It doesn't seem like it should be possible, but yet here it is. And that's the fun part about the 32X. There's a lot more hardware power inside of it than you've probably ever seen before, and would be so much fun to see other games like this brought over to the 32X. And when there's not many polygons drawing on screen at once, you're going to see the frame rate get up into the high teens, and you might even see in the 20-digit frames per second here. It just depends on how much is drawing on the screen at once with those dual Hitachi processors there. The 32X hardware is very similar to the Sega Saturn as far as the chips it's using and the way they are implemented, but obviously the Sega Saturn is going to have a lot more horsepower than the 32X ever did. And once you get a lot of polygons on screen at once, you're going to see that we're down to like 7 frames per second. In these large open areas, the frame rate is definitely going to dip, and that is just because it has a larger draw distance and actually has to draw more on screen at once. So anytime you're in a large open area, it is not uncommon for the frame rate to dip, but that would have been the exact same thing when you were playing this back in the day in hardware that it actually released on. PlayStation 1 would definitely dip as well. But this is the full fat implementation of Tomb Raider outside of the audio. You're going to have your weapons, you're going to have the different enemies, you're going to be able to shoot them just like you were playing the game. This just basically feels like a retail release outside of having no music whatsoever, and that is how impressive the work is that has been done to get this even running on the 32X in the first place. This is not just a tech demo where Laura runs around on a blank screen. This is Tomb Raider, the first level as you remember it, running on hardware that it never ran on before, and you will see there the camera can get itself all sorts of out of whack, but that was part of the original game as well. This was still the early days of 3D, and it was always impressive what the developers did just to get this game realized and running in the first place. Throw on top of that it now running on the Sega 32X, and that's even more fun of an experience. And that's why I say again, there is a lot more in the 32X than people realize, and I do hope that we see more games on it. You could do some amazing things in 3D, or if somebody wanted to release an actual 2D game on the 32X, maybe a beat 'em up utilizing all of the hardware editions, that would just be incredible. And you'll see here that sprite with the skull there, some Indiana Jones stuff if I've ever seen it. It does look really good here on the core and on the hardware as well. And that's the great thing about MiSTer FPGA. You can test these sort of things just by loading up a file. But I'm curious who actually played the original Tomb Raider back in the day. Tell me your experiences with it. I actually had it on PC first and then went to Tomb Raider 2 on the PlayStation 1. But this is a great game no matter what platform you played it on, and having a new version today is a ton of fun. But there's so many different Tomb Raider games that range in quality. Lara Croft and Tomb Raider definitely had a slump in the 2000s, but the series has reinvented itself and it's still with us today. That's how long this series has been around and the longevity it actually has, and that's why fans want to actually see stuff like this running. If there was no love out there for the original Tomb Raider, no one would actually spend the time trying to get it to run on hardware it never did. But OpenLara's goal is to basically get Tomb Raider running on any piece of hardware that it could possibly accommodate, and the 32X is the newest piece of hardware to that family. And I can't wait to see what OpenLara ends up running on next, but you have to realize how much work this actually takes. You're taking the base game and you're restructuring it and recoding it to run on non-target hardware. Obviously, this could run on the Sega Saturn, so some of the work is already there because the Saturn used those same Hitachi chips and instruction sets that you would see on the 32X. But this has been on 3DO as well, which is going to use an ARM processor, so there's a lot of work going on under the hood to make things like this even possible in the first place. And that's why it's so much fun to do videos on this sort of stuff and celebrate these things actually working. This is what keeps retro gaming alive, not just playing the games we used to love and remember, but having these new experiences and seeing hardware pushed to its limits in new ways that were never even imagined back in the 90s. Because trust me, there was never anything this good in 3D on the 32X. Metalhead would probably be the most impressive game that comes to mind, but Lara Croft and Tomb Raider here are just absolutely blowing that game away in the performance department as well as the 3D department. And I would say visually this game translates really well to the 32X. Sure, the textures are very pixelated, but it has a really good retro look to it. Sure, the frame rate is definitely low and can get into the single digits, but it still maintains its playability the whole way through. There's so much to explore and so much to see and so much to do here, but just remember, it is Tomb Raider, so moving around, navigating, and jumping are going to be as frustrating as they were back in the day, and that's just because this was still the early days of 3D, and navigating in a 3D space, especially for an action game, was still something that was going on and people were figuring out. But this is just the Tomb Raider everyone remembers and loves on hardware that it never existed on, and that means there's going to be a gigantic bear coming up. And I remember the first time I saw that in the original game, it scared the ever-loving hell out of me as a kid, having a bear rushing at me, and it's no different here. But this is just 10 out of 10 work. This does not seem like something that should be possible on the 32X, but here it is playing in front of you. And again, you can use software emulation, you can use MiSTer FPGA, and I've checked with people, you can use original hardware as well. So however you play it, definitely check out Tomb Raider on the 32X and be very, very wary of bears. They will come and they will kill you. But what won't kill you is checking out a new working game on the Sega 32X. No matter how you play it, definitely check it out. It is a ton of fun, but that bear 10 out of 10 times gets me. Bye-bye.